Hey, good morning. So today, last time when I was doing my demo on truck plywood, Chuck suggested that maybe someday people could just bring down whatever they use for carping, either plywood or lumber specifically. Everything I have is related to solid lumber, other than what we saw last week. So I'm not going to repeat any of that, but several people have brought different jigs. Looks like Ralph took a serious time to make some things pretty nice. But maybe we could make him be last so that's not embarrassing anybody else. That basically, I just wanted to, show us what you've made, how it works, maybe what doesn't work about it. I can tell you 3 things that I would do differently the next time I made the ones that I brought. And any tips and things that you might have in addition to an actual jig, just some things that can be helpful. I mean, it's if you have to learn it all the hard way, you can make a lot of firewood before you really get the hang of it. So this can save people making a little bit of firewood. Anybody want to be first? I'll be first if nobody else wants to. All right, go ahead. I'm here. I brought 2 jigs. One is very generic. We do all kinds of rails and other things with this. The limitation is that the maximum width is 2 3/4 inch on my saw, because I'm laying a board on its side here. The critical element of this is marked here as an 8-to-1 taper, and the fence setting. I want to make sure that it's very close to the fence, so there's no the blade. You can actually slice a little off of it; it won't hurt anything. It still works fine. But the most important thing is to make sure that this is absolutely square. An interesting note is that if you want to test whether your table saw is completely square, cut a piece on this jig. If the end of it isn't exactly square, then your blade, either you haven't gotten it clamped in properly, or your blade is not exactly parallel. So spend a lot of time making sure it's square when you build one of these. And I used epoxy everywhere that was near the edge. And I also use hand screws. So when I go to use it, put a board on here so the end's hanging out here. Put a couple of hand screws here. I use the wooden hand screws so that if I accidentally cut this a little bit too far, all I do is cut clamp.
And there's lots of those.
Yeah. Well, if you go to yard sales. Yeah. Staggeringly inexpensive sometimes. Amazing. A new one is very expensive. Yeah. The ones at the yard sale are like $2. Yeah. So that works for anything that's up to about 2 1/2. I can't remember exactly, 2 1/4, 2 1/2, something like that. But 1/4 inch plywood plus whatever the height of the blade is its limit. And it works great. I would say it's a little bit dodgy with very thin stock, because when the blade starts to cut it, it can start to chatter. And once it gets started chattering, it gets worse and worse until it fuzzes up the end. And always, what I recommend is I cut all of my scarf on my bandsaw first. Mark out the line, cut it on the bandsaw. That gets you very close, and then you're just cleaning it up with this rather than, because if you had an end of a long board hanging out here, it's going to be all seriously out of control when it finally lets go. But if you cut it on a bandsaw, then you're just basically scraping off a layer to make it perfectly flush. And yes, it's kind of a one-off. Ralph will show you a much better version of the same thing later. I built this specifically because I had a 3 1/4 inch wide keel on a 15-foot boat, and I could not find a piece of white oak that was 16 feet long, just not to be had. So I had to scarf it, and it wouldn't fit on that jig, so I made this one. And the width of it is controlled by, I happen to have a spare router plate. So this slides back and forth. What you do is basically just slide the board up here. These holes are all drilled just so I have some little clamps that reach in there and clamp it down. And then you're just cutting cutting your angle like that. Once again, make sure, in this case especially, that you do it on the bandsaw first, so you're only taking 1/16 of an inch and not trying to, you know, if you're trying to plow off 1/2 inch of wood, nothing pretty is going to happen. And last thing for me is, if you're going to make a jig like this and use it, make sure that this is extremely stiff, however long it is. Ralph has a much longer one. And then make sure you get the right kind of bit. Well, 2 of them as an example of what not to use. So you want something usually referred to as a clean out bit or a planer bit. If you look at it, it has absolutely parallel faces. The faces they're flat right across the bottom. That will make a nice smooth cut. This will do the same job, but you have to run those little tips over absolutely every millimeter of the wood, so you're not going to get a smooth cut. That means you're going to be fussing around for a very long time. You're never going to get a smooth cut. Almost all bits are made with a little bit of a relief angle like that, so that they don't heat up. That one will get hot.
Oh, I see. So it's not the gap that troubles.
Right.
That tapers it.
Yeah, it's straight on the side, but the cutters have a little bit of a relief angle to keep them from generating heat. But that doesn't do what you need to do if you're going to do making a flat scar.
I've used that same, I have one of those that I use for a shop built wide board planer. Or you do the same kind of thing as that, only you're doing a flat cut rather than an angle cut.
So that's pretty much what I have to say. I would do a lot of things different about this one. One thing that, because that planer bit, there's no way that you can make it like a top bearing bit. It would be nice to have a top bearing bit to do that, but I never found a top bearing planer bit. So I put these rails in here so that you're not cutting out the edge, and I just cut carefully. It would probably be possible to engineer a stop or something so that, when you got to the edge, you couldn't go too far. I've never spent a lot of time. I used this only a couple of times, so I never spent too much time trying to make it better. So that's what I got. The other thing that I would say, and this is I thought about bringing one, but it's really nothing. It's just make sure you get a nice straight plank and extremely straight edge. Clamp them together, screw them together, whatever, so you have a perfectly straight alignment. Put packing tape in there, whatever, keep the glue from sticking. Because if you try to eyeball 2 boards to come together like that, if you're off by, let's say, 128th of an inch in lining them up there, 20 feet out, you're going to have to take off 1/2 inch to make it line up. So you're going to, and the odd thing is, you can get a board that's a little bit crooked. You pull it out straight, no one's ever going to notice. If you have a glued kink in it, it's going to be obvious forever. Just you cannot plane out a kink like that and then make it look like it wasn't there. So that's it for me. Next.
Well, what I've got is a variation. And so this on my table. But I used miter slot. And to reiterate what Mitch had to say is this absolutely has to be 90 degrees and perfectly solid. Well, I have had some good luck just cutting these just like this. One of the things that is hardest is you need to also hold this down, and so often I will use a block to hold the front edge down, and then typically I'm scarping stuff that's you know, you've got a 10-foot piece, so you've got all this stuff hanging way the hell out there. So getting this into the miter slot, all clamped down, and then making sure that it stays down in the miter slot is the key to it. It's just a really short cut, but you know that's the big deal. And then I've got a jig that looks like this, where it's just a 90 base, and that's what I clamp up my two pieces to align them so that piece that looks real similar to this, and then these two faces get clamped both down and to the edge, and that's what I use to align them. Because, like Mitch says, you know, this little bit here means that it's going to do that. You're never going to like it.
I don't know if you did, but I always, you want to cut your stock as close to finish size as reasonable, because the bigger piece of wood you try to carve, the longer your carve. You're throwing away feet of wood if you cut the angle first, and then. But I do always leave my stock about a 16th to an 8th oversized. Do the scarf and then plane it size. That cleans up your scarf joints and allows you, where you're making that overlap, if you don't get absolutely perfect alignment, plane that bit off.
And these are just a couple of offcuts. And
So what kind of blade do you use on the saw?
I just use a woodworker dip, so it's a 40 teeth and that gives you a really fine cut.
Yeah.
And you don't have to prepare the surfaces anymore. You just do your start with the sawn.
Well, I just have a minor variation. Mine is a simpler version of what. Very simple. This goes up against the rib fence and blade. I built this specifically for doing the stays on the mast for my scamp, and so it's specifically said. I glued this piece on here, and then remember I ran this through the table saw with the blade squared, and so make sure this is a nice right angle, and then I just take the stay and clamp it there. And then I have to be very careful making the cut. This is a 10-to-1 scarf. I have to be very careful making the cut that I stop, because the cut ends up showing up about here, and I don't want to cut it into my clamp. This is wide enough that it's pretty easy to keep it flat against the table. And I think I used out capture the end of the stave, an adjustable thing to hold up the end of it. So I didn't have to worry about this thing wanting to tip one way or the other. But so this was real quick to make. And for a thicker board, probably wouldn't work too well, because then you would end up cutting into the clamp. You'd have to use a different arrangement. So it's definitely just a one-off.
One other thing about that one, Mark, all of them actually, it's really nice to have a mobile base on your table saw, because I need to rotate my table saw 7 degrees square with my shop.
Yes.
Because, you know, if you got a stake that's 10 feet behind you, you know, it's gonna run into something. Your alley that you have for whipping long boards is typically fairly straight, and when you're running this thing through at an angle, you gotta match the angle.
Yeah.
Rotate your saw.
And in my case, I have to open a set of double doors so that I've got enough in-feed.
I had to open the garage door and the back door for the mast on that current project. Just and Ralph, I guess you're the other one. Anybody else waiting in line? Ralph's obviously spent more time on his jigs than I've done on mine.
I would say I spend a lot of time. I don't have a bandsaw, and I use this to cut everything from rub rails to shear strakes. So that's probably 6-8 inches wide. This has a 12-to-1 slope, and I just built it from scraps I had laying around. So I just happened to have this cutting board from something that was could repurpose. Just needed something flat and heavy. So this works with this. And I usually just set it on sawhorses, clamp it down, and often I'd have a 10-foot plank. The nice thing about this is the plank doesn't go anywhere. So I have a auxiliary outfeed roller for my table saw that I'd sit out there, and that would use that to get the plank level. I just put in a short piece that I might want to cut a scarf on, and so this just happened to be the plunge router I had. I use a 1/2-inch bit, a square bit. I just put a 1/4 inch in here for the demo. But seeing the one that Mitch showed, if I was going to do this again, I would definitely get that because it'd be a lot faster. Since I don't have a table saw to cut 8-inch or bandsaw to get rid of most of the material, I had to router everything. So it's rather laborious, but it wasn't like I didn't have spare time. So you take a 1/8-inch cut or so, and you just back and forth. So one thing I did was I waxed up the rails on the bottom yesterday when I was getting this set up, and I never used wax before, but I realized that definitely makes it a lot easier to slide. In fact, it's so easy you kind of have to make sure it doesn't get away from you. But the one thing I didn't use a stop previously. I would align it right to the end. So I think you kind of need to do one or two things. If I was going to do this again, I'd either have the stop. I'd probably have the stop, but I'd also put a consumable on top of this, so that when you're cutting, because at some point, if you don't get everything set up just exactly right, you're going to cut into your surface, which is kind of what I have here on the end. It's tapered off, which isn't ideal for getting perfect thin ends of your scarf. So a consumable, and then I didn't use the edge guide. I threw this piece in here, but I was always pretty careful that I didn't cut in, but that could be a problem. The other thing is that the rails that I cut, I realized that I probably should have made them a little bit higher, same slope but higher, so that I could, if I move this forward, somewhat forward, I'm not going to be able to slide over it past about here. So the way I have this set up, you have to start with it back far enough. you can, this will not rub on this until you get that amount of material removed. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah. So I set this up so that this plunge rider has an adjustment that you can use to control exactly how far up the blade goes. So I set it so that it's just ruffled, just about flush, or maybe a little bit above flush. And so once you get going, you're basically just okay. So I use a pretty thin piece of plywood. Okay. Yeah. And constantly had to have a stiffener. And I guess I started initially with these, which obviously isn't doing much for the mill. So I just kind of kept adding things until I got it stiff enough. And it's definitely stiff enough now. So, well, once it's clamped in, you just set her down until you have about the amount of cut you want. And you just start, it's like Pac-Man, you just kind of eat away until you cut everything and then go deeper. Eventually, you'll just move it forward. I put a mark, so this would be the final mark right here. So what I did was I figured out when you go put your plunge with it set up against the stop, you have this stop again. So and when you plunge down, you figure out where is it going to hit when you get to the very end of the piece of wood. So it turns out it would be right there. That would give me a perfect taper when I get to that point. So basically, either use a stop or use your eye, or use some way to make sure you don't go too far. And obviously, if you put a consumable, then it's not quite as critical that you stop at the right place, because you can just dig in your consumable. That's about all there is to that. So it's not very sophisticated. It was kind of a one-off. I had still one boat, wanted to get the job done, so I just whipped up something, and it worked out okay. Did a lot of things with it. Any questions?
Yeah. One comment. Looking at that reminds me that most people say a 12-to-1 scarf is appropriate for solid lumber.
Mhm.
I've got a lot of 8-to-1s, and I use epoxy.
Yeah.
I think that the 12-to-1 comes from an era of using something like reinforcement glue rather than epoxy.
Yeah.
I've had very good luck with 8-to-1, but if you make it a 12-to-1 jig, one of the considerations, or you look at what I can cut an 18-inch long scarf there, which means that I can cut a little, like almost 3 inches thick. You would need one 3 feet long. and that's when you're doing a 12-to-1 scarf. You can only if you got 12 inches of sled, then you can only do 1 inch thick lumber.
Right. Yeah. Again, so it was purpose-built. If I want to do longer, I'd obviously have to. If it was thicker, I'd have to have these longer. Or if it was thicker, I'd have to have these come up higher. The other thing is that some of the wood I was using, like the chimes, had to bend around my hull, and so that's part of the reason why I wanted a longer scarf. I actually did have one open up, even after epoxy cured. Thought it was cured. Bent it around, clamped it in place. Next thing I knew, it was starting to open up. So so I guess if it was flatter, having no curvature, definitely use less, use the minimum. So anyway, didn't learn. So that's one setup. I covered everything in that. Let me sound the other one.
With this wide, you could start planks.
Yeah.
But if it's doing narrow, you're better off with the other style jig.
Yeah.
Rather than
Right.
and so each setup has its own best use.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
table
other
subject
thing
are-
I did when we were rubber rails, but the other stuff was probably at least an inch and a half. You could probably, I would definitely do inch and a half on a table saw.
Yeah.
And if I had the bandsaw, then even better. Yeah,
Because for doing planks, yeah,
if I was gonna build another boat, I first thing to do is pull by bandsaw.
Yeah, you could do plywood easily on that kind of thing as well. And you'd have trouble with 12-to-1 just because it's very difficult to do the plywood feather edge at 12-to-1 without destroying it. You know, it's just so thin or so far that if you even breathe on it, it's break it. It's the same is true with solid lumber. With solid lumber, you could make the lumber like thicker than, you know, and plane it after it's glued. And I used to run my scarf through the planer very carefully, only in the correct direction. But I've forgotten, and it doesn't matter. Even when you run it through so that the little feather edge is going straight into the cutters. If you epoxy that thing together, it's more like one piece of wood than two. I've had them split elsewhere where the cutter picks up splinters and stuff, but I don't get tear out in the scarf.
So this one is obviously plywood. And so again, I looked online to see what was available, and I guess there was a jig that you could buy that used hand circular saw. But I don't know, that was $100 and some odd bucks, and I thought, well, surely I'm clever enough to come up with something on my own. So I had this power planer. It was a going away present from the guys I worked with, and so I didn't really have a lot of use for it on the boat. But then I thought, well, how about scarf and plywood? Okay, so what do you really need to do to start plywood? So all you really need to do is come up with a way to tilt the planer. So if you look at this, you can see that the fence is not quite perpendicular, but that by itself isn't gonna. I mean, you can't really put that up against a half-inch piece of plywood and have it, you know, hold. So you really need something auxiliary. So that's why I whipped up this hardwood frame that bolts to the fence. I got, let's see, I drilled a few holes and screwed this thing in. And so we're trying to, this is one of the disadvantages is it's a narrower power plane that's only 2 1/4 inch. Didn't really that helpful for doing half-inch plywood, but it gets you started. And being kind of lazy, I thought, well, I'll let this do the first part, and then I'll use the hand plane to do the rest. It definitely gives you a reference, gets you, more than halfway there. So just a kind of for demonstration, you can see what this does. If you look at the space here, this is 60 millimeters wide, and if I put a millimeter rule on it, the difference is going to be somewhere around 6 or 7 millimeters. So that gives you your 8-to-1 roughly slope, right?
Not that it's exactly critical.
Yeah, right. But this is adjustable. So if you want to make it more or less, all you have to do is loosen a couple wing nuts, and this thing will pivot with the fence, and you can change your slope that way. So that's kind of nice. So once you have it, I came here with a piece of plywood, fully thinking I was going to be sawdust, but I guess it won't. You just put it up against here, pull the trigger, and away you go. And you just keep on taking multiple passes, and it's set up for I think about a 32nd of an inch cut, and you can get less or more, but just keep on going, and eventually you'll get to a feather edge, and you'll have your taper to the full width, and then from there you get to work with hand plane to do the rest.
Do you have an issue with the as you get down toward the feather edge, you're essentially gliding that fence on the edge of the plywood. When that gets to be microscopically thin,
Right.
you need some other way to keep them pressing into it.
Right.
But you could use it.
Yeah, you could put
Yeah.
another fence.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And
I
one
don't think
thing-
I don't think I did that, but I also remember that I have a little bit of a ratty edge from time to time.
Cutting in that direction would anyway, that's why he does it at an angle.
Yeah. One nice thing about this is that it's got a spiral blade, which helps a little bit.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's,
so that's
a big step up from.
that's why I pay a little extra.
Yeah.
But like I said, I would have bought it out of myself.
Makita, I haven't seen.
This was just, this wasn't for planks, just the bottom sheets. I had the scarf, multiple bottom sheets. Since basically one piece of plywood, tall plank on the skiff that I built, in theory, you could have scarfed it together, but being I was working mostly by myself, I decided I didn't really want to try to put a scarf piece of plywood on the boat, while it's curving. So I ended up blocking it, but I did use it for all the bottom planking. So that's it. It works pretty nicely. Any questions about it?
One point today, I think, about all of these jigs, we talked about making an 8-to-1 or a 9-to-1 jig or a 12-to-1 jig. It really doesn't matter very much. If you make one that's 9.4-to-1 and you use it to cut both faces, they fit perfectly. So whatever, it doesn't have to be very accurate. What you want is long enough faces so you have a lot of glue area, and not so steep that you're just tearing out the end, that you can't cut the ends. That's why plywood is hard to go past 8-to-1 because it's such thin stuff that. It doesn't, if it's 10-to-1 or 13-to-1, whatever, it'll all work as long as you use the same jig to cut both faces.
Probably the one part that's I'm not completely happy with is how I set this up to ride the edge. So I put these pieces of masonite on to get to the same height as the fence, but there is a little bit of a gap, and that's why I have these screws in here. You can adjust the screws so that they act as a place to ride. But again, as the plywood gets thinner, may or may not work. So you do have to be a little careful. I found when I was playing with it yesterday, in general, that the best thing is to keep pressure on the aft side. There is I see a little bit of a gap here. So when you get to the end, in particular, that's when it gets so tricky. So that when you come off the end, you just need to keep pressure here until you clear the end. If you don't, not be pretty. That's about it.
Nobody's ever done that before. Nothing epoxy won't fix.
and if you're gonna paint it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there's the varnish grade scarf, and then there's the paint grade scarf. Sometimes you start out with the varnish grade scarf, and you say, it'd probably be better if I just painted this.
Often there are other reasons for that as well.
Yes.
Actually, by the time I got to the rubber, it was varnish worthy, but before that.
Anybody else have any, either, if you don't have a jig, if you got any tips or thoughts or whatever?
Practice, practice, practice.
Yeah, there was one that Tim was asking about.
Yeah.
Making a mask and scarfing. And one observation, besides dealing with wood that's kind of a little warpy and twisty, it also allows you to make a much shorter scarf. Imagine you're making a 3-inch mask and you want to put a 12-to-1 scarf. You're going to lose 36 inches of wood if you have a solid blank and you cut a scarf. If you cut it in quarters, you're going to lose 18 inches. So for many reasons, I tend, even if I'm making a solid mass, cut it in quarters and glue it back together. Because I was telling somebody, I picked out a board that I thought looked pretty good for the mass that I'm currently working on. Goes through the table saw and it does this number. And what you can do is you can turn those things over, clamp them together, and they straighten each other out. So I finished gluing up the whole thing, and it's within 1/8 of an inch perfectly straight. You know, the last bite at the after is when you get a big square blank and you're making a tapered mass, you don't have to have the glue line right in the middle. You can cut the curves if you want, as long as you got enough wood on both sides. So for many reasons, cutting something down before you scarf it, it also allows you to, if you have 4 scarves, to put them in different spots in the mass, and you don't have one spot that looks like a zipper. In truth, I don't think it matters very much because epoxy scarves are so incredibly strong.
Another thing about making straight masks is if you do a hollow mask, and so you're using bird's mouth cuts, you know, each one of those staves has a right angle cut in it. And so the result of that is when you assemble the mast from, you know, staves that are all not straight, the mast ends up being straight. You know, it straightens itself out because of all those right angle cuts. And you know,
the only way it can fit together is to be straight.
right. So you don't have to do very much to get it, you know, perfectly straight.
If you just go to the wood store and buy wood, and then cut off everything that isn't straight, pretty soon you have a big pile of kindling ammonia in the ball.
That'd be a good demo to show how to flatten boards on a joiner or by hand with hand planers. That'd be interesting.
Some of them are really, I've struggled with finding a way to straighten out a board when you get so long. I have, you know, the typical joiner, which is, you know, the standard. It's not a long bed, and up to about 6, maybe even 8 feet long, you can improve a board considerably. When they get longer than that, I don't think you can improve them, because by the time you've gotten to the point, the piece you want to cut off, the ends are hanging over, it's sagging, and you're not going to be able to straighten the board out. Plus, you know, if you've got a whole bunch of warp in a 12-foot long board, you're going to have to cut 3 inches off of it before you get it straight.
You can still improve your situation somewhat by scoping out the board, seeing where it's low, and then just doing the ends.
Yeah. When I was making the mass I'm working on, the first thing I did was just snap a chalk line and cut one edge with one little tiny circular saw.
Oh yeah.
To get it as straight as I could make it.
Right.
Just clamp straight edge onto it and cut that as straight as I could, and then work from there. But still, you know, they wind up.
Yeah.
And there you just choose the pieces you glue together so that they fight each other rather than help each other. I did have one scarf in an oak journal that opened up, Ralph. But I think that was me being too anxious. You know, that's 24 hours ought to be enough. Probably it is, but 48 is better.
It might have been the same.
Then I suspect that
Remember, it was a summer as well, so it probably cured slower.
yeah, if you're working in the winter, it may take a week before your epoxy gets full strength.
We do the weekend, let's say that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. and I've had the experience of unclamping a glue lat straight. You know, you want to get the clamps off so you can scrape off all that extra glue, but not a moment too soon. when you take the clamp off and a big smile opens up. I wonder if I can fix that.